Hello and welcome to the final session of the Net Zero Transition, sponsored by Capita. My name is Emma Gatton and I'm the Environment Editor at the Daily Telegraph. This session is about living a net zero lifestyle. And so over the next 45 minutes, I will be talking to our panel of experts to discuss the changes needed in our homes and lifestyles to tackle climate change and to answer the difficult question of how much will our lives have to change and who will pay for it. I would now like to welcome my guests, Conservative MP and former Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom, and Small World Consulting founder Mike Berners-Lee. Hi, Andrea and Mike. Thanks for joining us. Start off hearing some opening remarks from my guests. If Andrea, if you would like to kick off.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's a great question. How do we all live a net zero lifestyle? And for me, as a politician, and as you say, Emma, as an ex-energy minister, I feel the last 6 or 7 years, having been energy minister back in 2015, when we had the Paris climate change agreement, which was such huge hopes for the world, but still so much to do, all the way through to now, where we're still in the middle of COP26. And having visited last week, I feel very much more optimistic that the world is taking this very seriously. But of course, it's not just about governments and world leaders, and it's also not just about businesses and what they can do, but it is for every single person to look at how they can improve their own carbon footprint and start to tackle the issues themselves. So for me, I absolutely think that people need help. I think what government needs to do is to set parameters, to provide taxpayer funding to spark new businesses, new supply chains, as the government has just done, for example, with heat pumps, to try and help people to transition away from gas-fired boilers, oil-fired boilers, and so on, to heat pumps to heat their homes. Likewise, with the plug-in grants for electric cars, so that to help people to transition away from internal combustion engines. So the government definitely has a role to play in using taxpayer funding to get those supply chains up and running. But actually, interestingly, what I saw in the sort of 6 years from being energy minister to being Secretary of State is that the economies of scale, once you get critical mass, whether it's in people's transitioning to heat pumps, whether it's people moving to electric cars, whether it's offshore wind turbines, solar panels on your roof, whether it's onshore wind turbines, all of those different technologies, the economies of scale mean that they do become cheaper and cheaper. And so for people as individuals to make choices, there is an element of when's the right moment. So, in my case, for example, I live in an old stone house, very, very drafty, and we've focused on insulating the windows. We have solar panels to heat the water, but it doesn't really do much for the house. And we're trying to research for ourselves what more can be done. Government needs to help with that. And I think that will be something post COP26 that they'll want to do. But also for individuals, people have to look at their own lifestyles. There's a lot people can do with, reducing, recycling, reusing, all of the great catchphrases. And at COP26, we heard from many young people on Youth Engagement Day last week about what things like the International Scout Movement are doing, what different groups are doing to try and protect and conserve our environment. So I'll leave it there, but really keen to answer questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Andrea. Really interesting insights there. Mike, please give us your thoughts.
Well, I agree with quite a lot of what Andrea said just then. If we get this right, the transition to low carbon living can be an opportunity to improve the quality of our lives overall, for sure. There are going to be 1 or 2 crunch points, and we'll come on to those. And there are 1 or 2 places where we just have to bite the bullet and make a change that we might otherwise not want to make because the planet demands it. But overall, it can be an opportunity to live better. Andrea is also right that the government needs to come in with some help in some certain key places, and not least to make sure that everyone's okay with this change, because there are going to be some people who, if we're not careful, are going to get caught out. And the role of the individual is huge in this. Everybody's asking, where does leadership come from? And some of it for sure is coming from individuals, and all of us for sure have a responsibility on this. And by showing willing ourselves and by making change at the individual level, we encourage businesses to cater for a market full of people who care about this. And also, it's very clear, we give government more confidence to go and take a stronger line on it as well. So all these three kind of groups go together. And then what are the changes that people can make? So, a very important part of the change is cutting our own carbon footprints. That's absolutely for sure. Even as important, or maybe even more important, is to be asking, where else can I exert influence? So any of us who go to work, we can exert our influence as best we can in the workplace. Whenever we vote, for sure, only ever vote for politicians who really get this climate agenda and are serious and coherent and trustworthy on it. I mean, that's something all of us can do. And in terms of our own carbon, the average person's carbon footprint divides up into about 4 quarters. About a quarter of it is food. And there are some clear-cut things there which the science is saying very clearly, less meat and dairy doesn't have to be zero, but quite a lot less meat and dairy. And the good news there is that there are health opportunities and all kinds of, it's habit changing, but there's lots of opportunity. The stuff around, as Angela mentioned, stuff about the inedible things that we buy. And, a lot of that is an opportunity to dematerialize, to have more quality things that make them last longer. There are huge economic opportunities, especially for our local economies, about getting things repaired better and so on. And then there's our housing, which is a real crunch point for many of us, especially as like Andrea, if you live in an old stone house, I live in one of those too. Actually, there are a lot of people will need some support there because it is very expensive. It can be very expensive. The payback can be a long period of time. The good news is it's a real jobs opportunity while we're at it. So if we get that right, and if we can find revenue streams from taxing high carbon things in a way that then supports transition to lower carbon things, I think there's, but it does take some real government action on that one. And then finally, all our travel and transport, and the transition to electric cars is one thing that I agree, it will gather momentum. I think the government needs to really support that one because actually the pressure on the grid and the environmental pressure of all the batteries that are going to be required, particularly for heavy transport, getting the role of hydrogen on our roads right, because it clearly has a big role, and all that needs technology pushing as well. So, there's a role for us as individuals, but also governments. And finally, I want to say that I think by way of introducing this, you've either got to think that the world's not going to get on top of climate change, in which case we have to be planning for a really dark place for humanity. I think that's pretty clear cut. Or you've got to say the world is going to get on top of this. And if that's the case, then the technologies that are required for the low carbon transition are going to be so in demand around the world. And the countries that are smart enough to really get into those technologies hard are going to be world leaders. And, that is what I'd like to see a bold government doing.
Yeah, and Emma, may I just say I completely agree with what Mike said, and he's also absolutely right to point out this is a huge growth and job story. The UK in so many technological areas is leading, and it is going to be where our future, apprenticeships all the way through to brilliant science, going through sort of deindustrialization, that is where jobs are going to come from. So it's a fantastic story from that point of view. This whole idea that, we have to go and live in a yurt and starve, that is absolutely not true. And we should all feel really positive about that.
Yeah.
Quite right, Mike.
Interesting. I wonder, Andrea, Mike was talking a bit about some of the issues around our diets and lifestyle changes. I wonder how much you think what kind of role government should play in getting involved in those conversations about lifestyle changes that would help cut our emissions. Yeah,
so there's kind of two sides to that. There's the part of me that thinks, do I really want the government telling me what I'm allowed for breakfast tomorrow? That's really not going to play well, and nor should it. However, when I was actually DEFRA secretary, we banned microbeads in face washes and shower gels and so on, and that was a fantastic thing to do. And we've done a lot of work with the supermarket sector to ensure that they aren't wasting so much. We had the 10p charge for plastic bags, all that kind of thing that's really led to an extraordinary change in some of the totally unnecessary, as Mike says, inedible stuff that we have that we really don't need to have, as damaging our environment. So from that point of view, the government can certainly make sure that the regulations are there to protect the environment as much as possible. But when it comes down to foods, I think it's more that the government will set out plans. For example, in farming, we are setting out plans for our sort of post Common Agricultural Policy farming subsidies to promote local, high sustainable, good animal husbandry, good soil management, good protection of the watercourses and so on, as opposed to telling you can only eat beef on a Sunday lunchtime sort of thing. I feel slightly schizophrenic about that. There's a lot government can and is doing, but I don't think it should extend to telling you what you're allowed to eat.
Interesting. I mean, does that involve, maybe we can come back to this, but the question of carbon taxes? Do we have the right kind of carbon taxes on the right things at the moment?
I think carbon taxes absolutely play their part, and I've been advocating a zero emissions, a sort of regulatory program for cars, like they have in California, where in effect what happens is, because they're cutting internal combustion engines and they want zero emissions from the tailpipe, so what we have now is in California is each year every car producer has to produce fewer and fewer internal combustion engines, and if they don't do that, then they have to buy carbon credits from somebody who is performing better. So for example, a company like Tesla makes, I believe, something like 1/3 of their profits, which is a significant sum, from selling carbon credits. So you can see that kind of transition. Perhaps even more important, however, I think, is the potential for border carbon taxes, because a lot of people worry that the UK is only 1% arguably of global emissions, but of course we are exporting a lot of those emissions. It doesn't include shipping, it doesn't include aviation, and we know a lot of manufacturing goes on in places like China and places that don't have the good track record that the UK has. So border taxes, but then again that has to be worked on an international basis. So I feel, as we did with the digital tax, which was an international agreement, what the government should be doing now is focusing on those kind of border adjustments that will actually ensure that high emitting areas can't effectively produce more cheaply than low emitting areas.
Interesting. Yeah. Mike, just to kind of bring it back to the individual, you've written a book about the carbon footprint of everything. Should people be aware of their own carbon footprint? Should we all have an idea in our mind of what that is? And I mean, how are we supposed to know?
Well, yes, we should all try and have, it doesn't have to be exact, but a rough idea of our carbon footprint, because how else in order to be able to manage something, you have to have an idea of at least the rough sense of scale around it. So that's why I wrote How Bad a Banana's Carbon Footprint of Everything, to try and flush all this stuff out just in broad terms. And it's very doable to know, roughly speaking, that, and I describe it now, about 1/4 of most people's carbon footprint is the food, down to their food. If you're an average person, about 1/4 is your travel, which will be split between your driving and your flying for the average person. Obviously that varies person to person. About 1/4 is about home energy and stuff, and about 1/4 is kind of everything else, and not least the inedible things that we buy. And I think, and again, the government can help with some of these things. I think in terms of agriculture, we need to do a really careful and clever job of getting the detail right on how we subsidize farmers so that they really can do the right thing with every piece of land in the UK. And that, there really is some serious detail to sweat out there. And if we get it right, people can earn a really good living doing exactly the right thing with the land. And the tax thing, again, if we get the taxes right, and the border, just on the border tax, I totally agree with Andrea there, because actually very often, usually, there is quite a strong carbon case for having more manufacturing done in the UK. We're quite a carbon efficient place to do a lot of manufacturing. And whilst it's at the moment often a bit cheaper to go off and get it done in the Far East or something, it can be easily 3 times the carbon to do so.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Andrea, is the government at the moment being honest about how much this transition is going to cost people?
You know, that is such a difficult question to answer, because basically nobody knows. But exactly what the cost is to decarbonise for the individual. Sorry, just to finish that point. But what is clear is that we do have quite a wealth of evidence now that there are significant economies of scale in decarbonising technologies. So, for example, you know, when I was energy minister, we did the first contracts for difference for offshore wind farms, and the cost of production, the cost of the subsidy, was £150 per megawatt hour. Now, recent CFDs have come in at under £50 a megawatt hour. So that kind of reduction in cost, and likewise we know that solar panels have reduced by 80% in cost of installation. So we know that, as often with these new technologies, they're very expensive to start with, and gradually the cost becomes equal. And actually, just at COP26 last week, Al Gore was talking about the fact that already now it's cheaper to build a renewable power plant than a combined cycle gas turbine, or indeed a coal-fired plant. So to build an offshore wind farm or a solar station or whatever is actually cheaper now. So that's where, you know, when you sort of say, so what's it going to cost us? There's the transition. So there's the cost of this whole kind of stranded assets argument, where you're switching off gas turbines and then you're opening, whether it's nuclear. I mean, I'm a big fan of nuclear. I'd love to hear your readers' questions about nuclear. But when you build something new, there is a cost. Obviously, there's a cost. If you build a road, there's a cost. But actually, once that transition is complete, then actually you are potentially looking at lower costs, because these are by definition renewable, and the costs of sort of maintenance and so on are relatively low. So that's a terrible answer, because I can't give you a figure, but I genuinely don't believe anyone can. I also do think that there are some very specific, almost hidden values that at the moment are not taken into account. So when I was a kid, I was terrified of a world nuclear war. That's what persuaded me to become an MP when I was 13. It used to keep me awake at night worrying about it. I think teenagers now lie awake worrying that these idiots, you know, me and all of us on this call, that we're going to do something and it's going to destroy the planet and they won't have a home to go to. And that is worth something, you know. So actually tackling that, you know, it's our job to recognize that, you know, young people may be 20% of the population, but they're 100% of the future. And so we have to actually address these things. And I think there is an intrinsic value in that too. And then just finally, if I may, there is also the fact that a lot of this is about choice. So I, for example, if I was going to replace my boiler, I would actually want to shop around and see what makes sense for me. And I would prefer, all things being equal, to buy something that was carbon efficient. And lots of people are in that position. So the cost isn't necessarily, you know, pounds and pence, because actually it's the same as if you're choosing a car. You know, are you going to buy a sort of a smart car, i.e. a tiny little car, or are you going to buy a Lamborghini? That is a matter of what you can afford and what your preferences are. So it's not just as straight as saying, what is it going to cost every individual? There's lots of individual choices involved, and there's lots of doing something for our future of our planet involved.
Interesting. I mean, Mike, I don't know if you want to come back on any of that, or maybe you could ask, I mean, I'd like to know what you think of whether, how much are our lives going to change? You know, if we are going to achieve this target of net zero, how much are we going to feel it in our daily lives?
Well, I think in some of the details, I think we'll feel quite a lot of habit changing in some places in our lives. You know, probably I'd say not as much change as we'll experience if the world doesn't get on top of climate. That's for sure. You know, I think in terms of the cost to the individual, I think it's worth making the point that, you know, there are various ways in which you can go about adopting a lower carbon life. And, you know, if you've got few £1,000s in your back pocket burning a hole, then you can spend more money on adopting a low carbon life. But if you would like to save money and make it and do it as an economy, there are plenty of opportunities there. I mean, it's stacked full of them. It actually does cost a lot of money to go and buy clothing that you don't need and replace your furniture rather than getting it mended and stuff like that. And if you look at the economic benefits of having things repaired locally and sold secondhand or something, it's actually brilliant for local economies, and it's brilliant for the personal finances of people who are looking to save a bit of money, to have a high street where you can get anything you like repaired and maintained and bought and sold secondhand. So actually, by and large, I think it's a cost saving thing. And when we've done the big potential areas of spend for individuals are on transport. It's more expensive to get an electric car at the moment. That's changing fast. We bought a second-hand electric car. It's fantastic, and it costs us something like £7,000. I don't think that's a lot of money, for a car. It's some people would want something flashier, but that's changing, is what I'm saying there. I think retrofitting Britain's really old, leaky housing stock, that is, if there's anywhere where there's a financial crunch point for the individual, that's where it is. And that's where the government can help them, just by the way, provide a whole load of quality, really high quality jobs while they're at it, and how to get the money by taxing the right things. And that's also how to get the money for really pushing hard the low carbon technologies that we need. Just one thing on the nuclear, I'm a bit surprised, and I think the analysis is wrong on nuclear compared to the, investing in a similar way in really pushing the hydrogen technologies so that we can store energy through hydrogen and use hydrogen in all those, the technologies for creating hydrogen, green hydrogen in the end, storing it, getting it around to where it needs to be used, and getting the technologies for being able to use hydrogen at the point that we need to be able to use it. I think that's a better way of spending money than nuclear, but we could debate that one.
Shall we?
Yeah, sure. Whether or not you think there's a possibility of a show. I think although nuclear is getting safer, I still think there are some elements of it that are not. It's not a beautiful solution. But just on that, yeah, hydrogen is one of those technologies that's falling in price like a stone as it scales up. And what it absolutely needs is momentum behind it. And people are talking about it coming down to generation of hydrogen coming down to $2 a megawatt hour, maybe even down to $1 a megawatt hour. At those sort of prices, nothing else can compete with it, and it even knocks coal out as energy per megawatt hour. So I think hydrogen's huge in the future that we need.
Andrea, we have a question from one of our readers, Jeffrey, who asks, I assume this is about sort of active travel, but he says, how will people in rural areas with limited public transport be expected to cope? I mean, maybe you could talk a bit about whether you are concerned that there will be some sections of society that are at risk of being left behind, whether that's people in rural areas, different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, is there a risk there?
Yes, I mean, inevitably there is always a risk that those with the means to buy themselves an electric car and to install charge points and so on can always make that change faster. And likewise, at the moment the cost of a heat pump is very much more than the cost of a gas boiler. However, that is, if you look at individual cases, I mean, again, in my situation, not only do I live in an old stone house, but we're not on the gas grid either. So we have an oil-fired boiler, and it would be great to have heat pumps, but they're very expensive, and in an old stone house, they are questionably effective. So there's issues, first of all, with costs, and there's issues with how productive, how efficient they are. And these are all points going back to both Mike's and my earlier points about the economies of scale, the efficiencies. And for that to happen, you need to have a kind of critical mass. So, for example, last year, I think it was 1.5 million gas-fired boilers installed and 30,000 heat pumps. And so, that's of a difference of huge magnitude, which basically means that the supply chains for the heat pumps aren't really there, nor is the kind of installation expertise, and nor is the research, really. And Mike's talking about hydrogen. Well, there are those who say, well, let's take the CO2 out of the gas grid and then pump through to people's ovens and so on that way. But that is a way off. That is quite a considerable way off, and it's not going to be an overnight big bang thing. So I think, as with all of these things, yes, there are concerns over affordability. There are concerns over access for rural areas and for people who've got limited choices as it is. But that's the point about net zero by 2050. And I certainly hold very strongly to the view that the transition is absolutely key to this. And it is important that people in urban areas who live in sort of accommodation that could easily translate. I'm a big fan of decarbonising new homes, for example. We've got some great new developments in my constituency of eco homes that are almost completely self-contained in their energy generation and their water usage and everything. So, there's a lot more that can be done, but we must recognise we can't just say, right, well, bad luck, you may not have the money, but you've got to do it anyway. That's why there needs to be a lead time for all of these things.
If I could, I'll ask Andrea, how much of a consensus do we need to have around all of these things? If we can't agree, there has been some talk recently about whether we should have a referendum on net zero. It was obviously in the 2019 manifesto, but how much of a consensus should we have on this?
Well, how much of a consensus should we have? There are those who say when all politicians agree, you should get very worried. So, that's a bit of a philosophical discussion, but how much consensus is there? This is completely cross-party. There might be I would say less than half a dozen MPs of any party who would say, no, who cares about climate change? So I think there is huge consensus. And in my view, actually, this is very much, sort of like the belief in healthcare being free at the point of delivery. It is cross-party, and we might sort of poke fingers at each other and well, my commitment to this is better than your commitment to this, but the reality is that all parties are totally signed up to tackling global climate change. And again, I can see in the chat, which I'm sort of glancing at, that some people are saying, well, what about the health impacts of onshore wind farms, and what about what about the extent of development and so on? And all of these things absolutely need to be taken into account. But nevertheless, there is political agreement that climate change is it is the existential threat to our planet. So you won't find anybody disagreeing about that. And whether that should be a cause for concern is a different question.
Interesting. Karen, who has asked a question, asks, what measures have you both taken to adopt a net zero lifestyle? I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer and answer there.
Yeah, well, go for it, Mike.
Okay, well, I'll start off. But the first thing I want to say is that I don't think, just because I write books about this stuff, it doesn't make it any easier for me than it is for anybody else. It's we're all imperfect. We've all got to try and move forwards. We've all got to not beat ourselves up about our shortcomings, but not let ourselves off the hook either. So I do some things, and I try to find ways in which it's a lifestyle and quality of life improvement at the same time. And sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not. So good examples have been things like an electric folding bike that I take on the train and sorts out my commute to work instead of a car. Although if I do travel by car, I lift share in an electric car, and so those sorts of things. Dietary change. I eat some meat and dairy. I eat a lot less than I used to a few years ago. Actually, I think it's probably a healthier diet. I actually prefer it. It's funny how what you look forward to changes as you start to get used to different stuff, and as you try different things, and as the world moves with us, and the quality of low meat and dairy foods that's going on in restaurants is going up and up and up and up. And then things like buying less stuff. I'm usually wearing, usually a good chunk of the, I won't chuck a shirt out before I've turned the collar over it, but I might not use it on the very best, smartest occasions. I took the shoes I'm wearing now, I took them to 4 shoe repairers till I found one who was prepared to mend them, and actually they're pretty well good as new. So it's about, I find some things, but equally, if you look at my lifestyle, you'd find, well, he must be a hypocrite. He still lives in a leaky house that is probably twice as energy efficient as it was 2 years ago, but it's still not great. So plenty of room for improvement.
Andrea?
I'm working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the philosophy there is, we sort of try and do what we can, but, this is difficult. And so for me, what do I do? So likewise, the food. I mean, I'm actually very lucky in South Northamptonshire, my constituency. We've got lots of fabulous local food producers. So I buy local. So if we're having meat, it's coming from a local farm, and that's definitely delicious, and also doesn't do any food miles. And likewise, we grow vegetables in our garden. I'd like to say I grow them, but actually I pick them, but someone else is doing all that hard work. So food, try and shop locally. Try never, and that I include my grown-up kids in that, to ever get involved with fast fashion. I think there's a real problem with the kind of fast fashion, the incredibly cheap and high turnover clothing and so on. We've got solar panels to generate hot water. It's not enough to light or heat the house. We've got an electric oven, and as I've already explained, we live in a stone house. We've insulated as much as we can, and we're constantly on the lookout for new ways to improve things. Actually, here in Parliament, we have a great Lent thing that we do as women MPs to try and really reduce our carbon footprint during Lent, which is actually quite a challenge. And actually, obviously, when you do really try and make the effort to use everything that's reusable, to not throw anything away, to not use cling film, to not use anything plastic, blah, 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 it's quite challenging, but also it does change your habits. So doing it for a sort of short period of time can actually be quite encouraging to sort of stick with the changes. I'll leave it there. I mean, it is all very difficult. Actually, no, I won't leave it there. There's one thing I did want to say, and that is carbon offset. Before this call started, we were talking about the importance of enabling people to genuinely offset their carbon when they do something and they feel, I don't feel good about that. And I do have a grave concern about it's a kind of a license to cowboys to come in with sort of fake carbon offsets, give me the money and I'll take it down the pub and I'll tell you I planted you a tree. So what I would really like to see is a international sort of recognized type mark for auditing carbon offset arrangements, because again, this transition is very important. We can't change things overnight, and those who can and want to and can afford to could actually do more to be, improving habitats, planting trees and so on. But that needs to be through some sort of authorized, recognized authority.
Mike, I know you've got some thoughts on carbon offset.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a really, just before that, just on the food miles, Andrea, I just need to say, it's actually, the food miles usually turn out to be a pretty trivial component of the carbon footprint of your food. It's about what's in the food is the big deal most of the time. But just on offsets, yeah. So we need to cut our carbon. The world needs to get to net zero in a timely manner, and we can do some of that by removing carbon against some residual emissions. However, if you look at all the nature-based solutions that are possible in an environmentally responsible way, they turn out to be finite, whether it's tree planting, peat restoration, biochar, or there's a whole rack of them. They're all finite, and we need to do them all anyway. So the idea that you can offset an unnecessary emission somehow, it's that the concept just doesn't add up. And even the mechanical things like direct air carbon capture and storage, which we need to push that technology as hard as we can, it's still going to be really limited in what the world is going to be capable of doing. So there's no substitute at all for cutting the carbon in the first place. And what this means for the individual is, and this is for the company as well, the notion of an offset when you're not already cutting your own carbon footprint on a pretty steep trajectory is, it's a nonsense. And certainly the idea that you could feel any better about your flight to Ibiza or whatever it is because you've gone to an airline and paid £1.06 to offset your flight to Rome, supposedly, it's a complete nonsense. And the really dangerous thing about it is that in the back of our minds, it plants a seed of, oh, it's not quite so bad, at least I've offset it. So it makes us more likely to do a bit more. So it does quite a lot more harm than good. So, it's great to fund, if you want to fund some nature-based solutions to plant the right tree in the right place, that's a great thing to do, but it's totally separate from the challenge of cutting our carbon footprints that we all got to do.
Okay, so this is the first point of disagreement, because you're not being consistent, Mike. If it's a great thing to plant some trees and do some nature investment, then why is it not a great thing to do that because you feel you want to do something for the planet because you just went to Spain? So for you to say, well, there's no point offsetting, that's simply not true. I mean, yeah, you're right. If you're doing it in lieu of restricting your carbon footprint in any way, then I would agree. But the point I'm making is a different one, which is that if I don't know, many constituents of mine have parents and close relatives in Southeast Asia. They want to see the grandparents. So if they want to come and see their grandchildren, they should be able to do something which they can genuinely feel has offset the carbon. Now, I'm not talking about some Mickey Mouse £1.06, which I would agree with you doesn't cut the mustard. But it can't be true to say that, no, you must never do something to make yourself feel better about the appalling fact that you just got on an aeroplane. I just don't agree with you there. This transition, you will lose people if you don't allow them to mitigate their own activities.
So this is the point here, right? So I think we've all got to make a decision about whether we can justify our flight or not. And if we're going off to see a long lost relative, or even if it's an occasional leisure flight for a trip that we really want to do, right? Then it's all down to our consciences. And the way we square that with ourselves is we say, it's worth it, right? I'm prepared to incur this environmental impact for something that is this important to me. I'm going to do it. And if you can square it with yourself, then go ahead and do it. But there's there's good research out there that shows that just the notion of the offset, the idea that you've somehow undone the damage, creates a sense of, oh, it's okay to do it then. It makes it actually very often actually increases the frequency of that high carbon activity. And that works with businesses and it works at the individual level as well. So that's why it doesn't work psychologically to try to equate the two. So I'm not saying that if somebody goes off to visit their relatives on the other side of the world occasionally, that's something they should feel bad about. I'm saying that that's something that we have to do with, the knowledge that it comes with a burden and we do it because it's worth it. But we should just take it on the chin and accept it, I think.
Interesting. Andrea, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, again, I'm just going to say I'd have more sympathy with the argument about greenwashing and not allowing businesses to sort of say, oh, well, I planted a tree, so I can do whatever I want. I would have every sympathy there. But the reality is what I've seen. So I was energy minister in 2015 at the time of Paris Climate Change Agreement, where literally lots of people still said, no, climate change isn't real. It was genuinely still a lot of people saying that. Here we are in 2021, where COP26, I do believe, is a very positive turning point. We're now seeing, the UK was the first developed country to legislate for net zero. We're now seeing many countries following suit. They're actually legislating for net zero. So we're seeing a transition at the national leadership level of countries saying, okay, now we believe climate change is real. We're getting with the program, we're coming to the party, etc., etc. But out there amongst the public, you are not going to find, Mike, loads and loads of people saying, yeah, sure, I'll never travel again because I feel bad about this. You will find plenty of people who say that. But if you are going to make people guilt trip and not give them anything that they can turn to, then that I think is a problem. Because what I've seen is, as we've gone through this journey from 2015 to where we are today, is every country has tightened the thumb screws every bit of the way. So I announced we were taking coal off the system by 2025. Then as Energy Secretary of State, I brought it forward to 24, and it would have come even earlier if not for the capacity market to keep the lights on. But every country is on that journey, and every person is on that journey. So people who now think, oh, I'm never going to take a flight again, that's fine. What I'm saying. Most people don't feel like that. And so actually that's the point of carbon offset, is so that you can actually do that thing that you want to do without being guilt tripped and actually genuinely offset your carbon. And that's why I say it needs to be a properly authoritative offset, not a kind of random £1.6 that I'll then go and spend on sweets in the nearest news open, but actually something that genuinely offsets the carbon. Because also there is the potential down the line of these hydrogen or indeed electric assisted flights, which are coming down the track very quickly. Wrong analogy, because obviously planes don't come down the track, that's trains, but in case anyone's wondering. But actually, fan-assisted flight, where you only use jet fuel to take off and land, that will be for sort of local short-haul flights quite soon. And so actually then, you know, people can genuinely continue to fly or can take up flying again. And all of these things are in play, I think.
Yeah, in time we'll get on top of the flying, but it's one of the hardest technologies to crack. Right? We need to re-engineer our airplanes significantly, all the rest of it. In the meantime, I'm not saying nobody can fly. I'm absolutely not saying that. I'm not even saying no leisure flights. I'm saying we are going to need to be more careful about when we decide to fly, and I don't think there's any getting around that. And the nature-based solutions, which do need funding, are all fundamentally finite. And just on the kind of, I hope you're right to be optimistic about the COP. I mean, I do think the world is waking up, and I do think there's more action now than there's ever been at that COP. But the serious analysis on this is saying at the moment it is still looking like very seriously too little, too late. And more is, absolutely more is required. And if you look at the sum total of the plans and policies that are out there, it's taking us in at way over 2 degrees, and that's going to have really serious consequences for people by the billion load, which of course will end up affecting us all. So just in case there's any sense of, oh, it's okay, we're back on track, because if you look at the carbon curve so far at the global level, you don't see any, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, you don't see any statistically significant evidence that humans have noticed climate change yet. You can spot a pandemic in that curve, you can spot world wars if you go back, you can spot an oil crisis, but you can't see anything that actually looks like emissions from fossil fuel use coming, showing a dent downwards because we've noticed climate change. So the need to raise our game is so enormous.
Yeah. I think we're coming to the end, aren't we? But I would just the reality is that COP26, as I've already alluded, is actually where national governments, leaders are saying, yes, this has to be tackled. So to say, well, we've not seen it being tackled, they've just said it needs to be tackled. They are legislating for net zero. It is about the transition. And if you simply, go on the basis that you can't see it yet, well then, politics doesn't work like that, as you well know, Mike. But I feel incredibly optimistic. I think we've come so far from 2015 already. And over the next few years, we'll see the ambition step up country by country. I feel very positive.
Well, let's hope so. If we can see the ambition step up year after year, let's agree to hope that'd be a good thing. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to end on a slightly optimistic note. At least this is obviously a conversation that is going to go on in our lives for many years to come. So just thank you, Andrea and Mike, for the discussion and the insights, and thank you to everyone watching and everyone who participated in the conversation. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.